You know, the human brain, it's probably the most complicated thing we know of anywhere in the universe. For most of history, it was just this black box, a total mystery. So how on earth did we start to map it out? How did we even find the basic parts that let us think and feel and, be us? Well, let's dive in. Okay, just take a look at this. It's gorgeous, right? So intricate. It almost looks like some kind of abstract art. But what you're actually seeing here are the connections deep inside a human brain. And it just makes you stop and ask, what are the fundamental building blocks that create something this incredible? The answer, when you get right down to it, starts with a number, and it is an absolutely mind-boggling one. 86 billion. That's roughly how many special cells, called neurons, you have in your brain. Now, just try to imagine mapping a city with 86 times billion houses, all connected by their own little roads. That was the scale of the challenge for the very first neuroscientists. It's just immense. So, faced with that insane complexity, where do you even begin? To really get it, we have to jump back in time to when the brain wasn't just a puzzle, it was a true mystery, a vast unknown frontier. This quote from Santiago Ramon y Cajan, who's basically one of the fathers of modern neuroscience, just nails it. Looking at those 86 billion cells, the brain wasn't just something to be figured out. It was a whole world with these massive unexplored continents and huge blank spots on the map. And before they could even start drawing that map, scientists had to solve a huge, fierce argument about what the land itself was even made of. They first had to unravel this incredibly dense cellular tangle. And this was a major debate. You had two titans of science going head-to-head. On one side was the Italian scientist Camillo Golgi. He championed the reticular theory, believing the brain was all one big, continuous web of tissue, like a giant net. But on the other side, the Spanish anatomist Cajal proposed the neuron doctrine. He was convinced the brain was made of countless separate, individual cells that didn't actually touch, but communicated across these tiny little gaps. And here's where the story gets amazing. A truly incredible scientific irony. The key piece of evidence that proved Cajal was right was a technique invented by his rival, Golgi. It's called the Golgi Stain. And what it did was randomly color just a tiny fraction of the cells in a sample. It was like in a city with all the lights off, one single house suddenly lit up. And for the first time, Cajal could see an entire neuron, from tip to tail, and realize, wait a minute, it has a beginning and an end. It's its own thing. And with that, Cajal's neuron doctrine won. The idea that the individual neuron was the basic unit of the brain became the absolute foundation for all of modern neuroscience. But in a final, perfect twist, both Golgi and Cajal share the 1906 Nobel Prize for their work. Even though they disagreed, their combined efforts changed everything. So the neuron was officially discovered. But it turns out it's not the only star of the show. The brain really has two main types of cells. You've got the famous neurons, and then you have their absolutely essential partners, the glial cells. All right, first up, the neuron. This is the one everybody's heard of. It's the great communicator of the brain. You can see its structure here. These branching parts, the dendrites, they're like antennas, listening for signals. The cell body is kind of the command center, processing all that input. And then this long tail, the axon, that's the transmission cable that sends the message on its way. So what do they actually do? Well, their entire job is to talk. They generate these little electrical spikes and then chat with other neurons across those tiny gaps that Cajal discovered. We call them synapses. And just think about this. A single neuron might be listening to thousands of other cells all at once, somehow integrating all that chatter, and then passing on a single coherent message. That complex web is how we think and feel and do everything. But here's the thing. For all their fame, neurons are actually kind of helpless. They absolutely cannot do their jobs by themselves. They are completely dependent on an essential and way too often overlooked support crew. So let's meet the glial cells. The name comes from the Greek word for glue, because for the longest time, that's all scientists thought they were, just stuff that held the neurons in place. But we now know they are the absolute unsung heroes of the brain. You can see a couple of different kinds here, and there are at least as many of these guys as there are neurons. So what's their job? Oh, just about everything else. They are the brain's housekeepers, cleaning up chemical waste. They're the electricians, wrapping axons in this fatty insulation called myelin that makes signals travel over 100 times faster. They're the security guards and the paramedics, acting as the brain's immune system. I mean, without glia, the whole neural conversation would just fall apart. Okay, so we've met our two main cell types. But the real magic, the thing that makes the brain work, is how they team up in circuits. And to see what I mean, let's look at a really simple classic example that we've all experienced, the knee-jerk reflex.
You know the drill. The doctor taps your knee with that little hammer. That tap stretches a muscle in your thigh, and a sensory neuron connected to it basically shouts, "Hey, I've been stretched," and fires a signal straight to your spinal cord. Now, here is where it gets so clever. That one signal does two things at the exact same time. First, it tells a motor neuron to fire, making your quad muscle contract and your leg kick out. But simultaneously, it also activates a little connector neuron that tells your opposing muscle, the hamstring, to relax. Because if both muscles fired, you go nowhere, right?
And that's the pure genius of a neural circuit. It's not just about one action, it's about perfect coordination. Your leg kicks out in this smooth, automatic response, all in a matter of milliseconds, way before your conscious brain has even had a chance to process what just happened. That's the power of efficient wiring. Now, that reflex circuit, scientists figured that out over 100 years ago. So how do we, today, study the billions of much more complex circuits that create our thoughts, our memories, our emotions? Well, we use tools that Golgi and Cajal could have only dreamed of. Seriously, the jump in technology is it's monumental. We've gone from using chemical stains to get a single static snapshot of a dead cell to using high-powered lasers that let us watch and even control entire living networks of cells as they do their thing. One of these incredible modern tools is called calcium imaging. Turns out, every time a neuron fires, a little bit of calcium rushes into the cell. So scientists figured out how to add special molecules that glow whenever calcium is present. And the result? You get this. We can literally watch hundreds of neurons flashing on and off as an animal sees something or makes a decision. We're pretty much reading the brain's code as it's being written. But it gets even crazier. If calcium imaging is reading the code, then a technique called optogenetics is about writing it. This is straight out of science fiction. Scientists can take light-sensitive proteins from things like algae and insert them into specific neurons in the brain. Then they can shine a tiny fiber optic laser, like you see here with this mouse, and turn specific cells on or off just with a flick of a light switch. It lets them figure out exactly what a circuit does with mind-blowing precision. So all of this brings us to one last really profound question. We've gone from the brain being a complete mystery to developing tools that let us read and write its fundamental code. So what's next? What does this mean for understanding consciousness, for curing terrible brain diseases, for really exploring what it means to be human? The old maps have been filled in, but it feels like the true age of exploration is really just beginning.